Thank you. I am delighted to welcome you to the second annual Joel and Judith Kupersmith Lectureship in Health Ethics and Policy at New York Medical College. I am also delighted with the topic, which raises significant and controversial issues with the strongest of ethical and policy components. One of the purposes of this lectureship is to close the gaps that occur between scientific advance and ethics and policy related to the advance. Transplants have been an important part of our therapeutic armamentarium for a long time. The first successful human organ transplant was a renal transplant performed in 1954 between identical twins, and the first involving immunosuppression was in 1962. So this scientific advance has been with us for many years, and we are still discussing what is a major ethical and policy issue: compensation for the donor. Chancellor Halperin's and Rabbi Fogel's discussion in this lectureship will be an important contribution to the understanding of a most important question. I look forward to its analysis, reasoning, and interpretations to help formulate my own opinions on the subject. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone here in the auditorium, and for those of you watching online, my name is Edward Halperin. For those of you seeking CME credit for today's program, you have two choices. You can either get out your cell phone or other device and send a text message, 16LACK, 16 LAC, to the phone number 828-295-1144. If you do that, you're going to get a text message back giving you instructions how to fill out your satisfaction questionnaire and how to get your CME certificate. If you're higher tech, you can get your QR reader and point it at the QR code on the screen, click on it, and you will similarly be taken to a website where you can fill out your satisfaction questionnaire and you can get your CME certificate. In either case, this system will expire on the 13th at 3:30. So I suggest you take a screenshot or you write the number down so that you'll pick up your CME credit before the system expires. Rabbi Fogel and I are going to be chatting with you this afternoon about the ethics, economics, and Halachah of compensating living kidney donors with federal tax credits. My name's Edward Halperin. I'm the Chancellor and CEO of New York Medical College. Rabbi Fogel and I have no conflicts of interest to declare in reference to our remarks this afternoon. The sponsors of today's lecture are Dr. Joel Kupersmith, who has worked as a cardiologist, scientist, medical school dean, CEO of a practice plan, and leader of a VA research program. He is now Professor Emeritus of Medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center. And Dr. Judith Kupersmith, a psychiatrist who was early in her life a dancer with the New York City Ballet, a graduate of Hunter College and New York Medical College, and established the first of its kind specialty clinic, the Performance Art Center for Health. The remarks that we're going to share with you today are the views of myself and Rabbi Fogel. We do not speak for the Kupersmith family. There is, however, one word from our sponsor. Once a year, Touro University and New York Medical College publish this journal in hardcover form, the Touro University New York Medical College Medical Halachah Annual. Volume 3 was issued a few weeks ago. The remarks that Rabbi Fogel and I are going to share today will appear in next year's issue. If you'd like volumes 1, 2, or 3, they are available online at the website of Mosaica Press. You go to Mosaica Press's website, look for Medical Halachah Annual, and you'll find volumes 1, 2, and 3 for sale, or they can be ordered via your favorite bookstore. I could plausibly argue that I was minding my own business, not looking for any extra work, when I got roped into this topic by a retired nephrologist Dr. Bob Gutman, retired from the nephrology faculty at Duke, who at Kiddush one day after services at the synagogue told me he was supporting this new bill before the House of Representatives for federal tax credits for living kidney donations, and therefore I should be working on the ethics and halachic aspects of the topic. But in fairness, I do have a history that goes back with renal transplantation. This dashing young radiation oncologist was at one time me. And one of my first papers was a concern I had as to whether or not irradiating a rejecting kidney did any good. It was commonplace in the early 1980s that in the face of renal transplant rejection, the transplant surgeons and the nephrologists would call a radiation oncology consult, and we would dutifully go up to the floors and administer 150 centigrade times 4 fractions to a total of 600 centigrade in an attempt to forestall rejection. I wasn't sure it worked. And in this clinical review of the experience of the Massachusetts General Hospital, I found that it usually didn't. But those of you who are in the world of transplantation will notice some famous co-authors: Frank Delmonico, longtime transplant surgeon of the Mass General, the legendary Harvard surgeon Paul Nelson, and another legendary Harvard surgeon, A. Benedict Cosme. Increasingly interested in the use of radiation as an immunosuppressive, I did my resident research project on whether or not the administration of total lymphoid irradiation could be used to breach the species barrier in organ transplantation, doing heart and kidney transplants from rabbit to rat, rat to rabbit, rhesus to cynomolgus monkey, pig to monkey. And once again, you will see the name of the famous transplant surgery, A.B. Cosme, and the cardiac transplant surgeon who died much too young, Gary Haas. When I won the Residence Award for 1983-82 for this project, to give you some indication of the culture in which I was trained, the chairman of the department at Harvard, Dr. Herman Suit, walked up to me in the hallway and said, quote, "Well, Edward, I see you won the award for Resident Research Project of the Year. I suppose the competition wasn't very stiff this year." That was the compliment. My experimental model was to take a cobalt-60 machine, fashion a lead attenuator and field shaping blocks, and give total lymphoid irradiation to an anesthetized cynomolgus monkey in this wooden jig that I had constructed. And you can see here radiation therapy fields, which look similar to that for Hodgkin's disease, a mantle field and a so-called inverted Y field. Eventually, this led to long-term survival of cross-species transplantation in multiple animal models. With that as the basis for my interest in the topic, let us now turn our attention to the background for why Rabbi Fogel and I are here to talk with you this afternoon. We'll begin our inquiry by considering the gap between supply and demand for kidneys for transplantation in the United States. Over 500,000 Americans are on dialysis. About 90,000 are on the waiting list for a renal transplant. Roughly 4,000 Americans die every year while waiting for a kidney transplant. And since 1995, 120,000 Americans have died while waiting for a kidney transplant. The best option for most dialysis patients is transplantation. If you look at the survival rates at 1 year and 5 years for individuals on hemodialysis, they are respectively 81% and 40%. On peritoneal dialysis, at 1 year, 90%, and in 5 years, 41%. But if you receive a renal transplant from a cadaveric donor, the survival rises to 94% at 1 year, and you see a near doubling of survival at 5 years, and an even better survival for living donor renal transplants, 99% at 1 year and 87% at 5 years. So clearly, The superior therapies for long-term survival are number one, living transplantation, number two, cadaveric transplantation, and then inferior, staying on dialysis. Now, what has been tried or discussed in an attempt to increase the number of living donors to deal with this distance between supply and demand? Health education doesn't make much of a dent. Now, you can change the default response on driver's licenses. You all know this from any form of social psychology. Once you buy the magazine subscription, if it's going to renew automatically, very few people ever cancel. It just rolls over. The same with your credit card. It just rolls over. So if you have to check a box on your driver's license to be a transplant recipient, not a lot of people do. If your driver's license comes with the box already checked and you have to uncheck it, then in states that do that, the number of transplant candidates goes up. This, of course, does not affect living donor transplants. It does affect cadaveric transplantation. There is currently a federal law in the books that pays up to $6,000 for eligible living donors to help defray their expenses of being a donor. There is a bill currently that has gone through the House and is in the Senate called the Honor Our Living Donors Act, which seeks to expand the eligibility for this reimbursement and not have it be based on your income. Other ideas which have been floated to increase kidney donations are, if you're a donor, we'll pay for your funeral expenses, we'll make a cash payment to your estate, we'll make a donation to the charity of your choice, we'll pay your life insurance premiums, we'll pay your health insurance premiums, we'll somehow forgive a loan. None of these have been implemented, but these are ideas that you find in the literature. Still, about 3/4 of donations in the United States are from cadaveric donors. And if you're a living donor, you have to deal with the pain, discomfort, logistics, lost work time, lost income, the risk of death or long-term adverse effects of the surgery, and going through life with one kidney rather than two. Topics we're now going to consider in some more detail. The proposed solution on the table for discussion this afternoon is a bill called the End Kidney Deaths Act. This bill in brief is only about altruistic donors. It's not making a donation to your sibling or to a parent, and it's not about making a donation in some kind of chain or domino effect. If the bill passes and the president signs it, then if you're a living kidney donor for an altruistic donation, you'll get a $10,000 tax credit per year for 5 years off your federal taxes. If your income is so low that you're not paying federal taxes, you'll get cash up to $10,000 a year for 5 years. It is alleged, if you do modeling of this, that because mostly the taxpayers pay for dialysis, then we're going to save over $14 billion a year because it's cheaper to pay for a kidney donation than to pay for the dialysis. And so it is at its base an economic incentive to have more living kidney donations and bridge the gap between supply and demand. Now, the difference between this End Kidney Deaths Act and the Honor Our Living Donors Act is the End Kidney Deaths Act, which has been introduced in the House, will give you either the tax credit of $10,000 a year or cash for $10,000 a year. The Honor Our Living Donors Act will make it easier to get reimbursement of your expenses up to a total of $6,000 for pain, suffering, lost time of work. If you start paying people with either tax credits or cash for being a living kidney donor, then you're going to butt up against a federal law that was signed by President Ronald Reagan, the National Organ Transplant Act, which explicitly bans people from selling their organs to stop a business of organ trafficking. It shall be unlawful for any person to knowingly acquire, receive, or otherwise transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation if the transfer affects interstate commerce. It's a federal law. So if the tax credit bill passes, it will supersede this law. But our questions are, is offering a financial incentive for living kidney donation an exploitation of the poor, who will more likely need to sell their organ for financial compensation, or will be a boon to the poor who are more likely to have end-stage renal disease and end up on dialysis. Indeed, we already pay people for donating blood, blood products, sperm, eggs, and for being surrogate mothers. But we're going to have to think critically about these arguments. Donating hair or having a tube of blood drawn or donating serum or donating sperm does not create a lifetime risk and does not have a significant mortality rate. But being a kidney donor does. Dr. Kupersmith in his introduction alluded to the 1954 kidney transplant between twins. This is a picture of Dr. Joseph Murray receiving the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, which he shared that year with E. Donald Thomas for his work on bone marrow transplantation. Murray wrote at great length about the ethical issues he encountered in the first kidney transplantation. Many of the concerns that Rabbi Fogel and I are going to talk about were discussed by him in his memoirs. Number one, a surgeon takes someone to the operating room to make them feel better or to further their care. They're there to help the patient. And when they get informed consent to do surgery, it is with that promise. But taking a living kidney donor to the OR will not make them physically feel better. It'll make them feel worse. There's a risk they'll die on the operating table or in the post-operative period. And so this is a new ethical dilemma for surgeons, taking someone to the OR for the benefit of a third party, not for the benefit of the person on the operating table. It also raised in Murray's mind the issue of what is our long-term requirement for the care of the donor. He describes in his memoirs how the sibling donor of the first twins transplant says, "Will you take care of me for the rest of my life? If I donate this kidney to my brother?" Of course not. We have no obligation to, the team says, but we'll do it out of moral obligation. You think we're going to abandon you? But that won't be the case for someone in 2026 making a kidney donation. They'll be at the mercy of the health system. Okay, so what is the risk to the living kidney donor of dying, either on the operating table or in the month thereafter? As we have increasingly gone to laparoscopic removal of the kidney for living donors, the mortality rate has dropped from 3 deaths per 10,000 now to about 1 death per 10,000. But it's not zero. There's still a risk of death, most often from hemorrhage. So there is a mortality risk from being a living kidney donor. What are the other risks, as Murray raised? What happens if you go through life with only one kidney and you don't have any built-in excess capacity and you get renal disease, or you get cancer of the remaining kidney, or you get into an accident and suffer trauma and you only have one kidney? Will you be less insurable if you only have one kidney? Will employers worry about it and not want to hire you because they think you'll be a risk to the employee health plan? These are all risks that the living donor runs. Quickly, this conversation might turn to, well, they do pay living-related kidney donors in Iran, so what does this social experiment show? I have no idea. Iran pays roughly $2,000 US. The data is contradictory, inconsistent, poorly reported from a weak public health system. People have tried to invoke the Iranian data. I cannot make any sense of it. There is, we are told, a significant black market in kidneys in Iran. It clearly has not done away with that, but there is nothing further I can say helpful in our conversation this afternoon about Iran, except to tell you they do pay living-related donors, but what the outcome is unclear. I want now to consider some of the economic issues going on here. What would the dismal science of economics have to say about this? What would I say as a former college economics major at the Wharton School? The Nobel Prize in Economics was given years ago to Gary Becker. He's standing on the left, and that's the King of Sweden on your right. Becker's main contribution was to assert that many types of human behavior can be understood as a rational attempt to maximize utility. including behaviors often viewed as altruistic. People do things to maximize their economic or personal sense of well-being, and Becker sought to model that. So where did the $50,000 come from in this End Kidney Death Act? Where'd they get that number? Why isn't it 35,000 or 90 or 110 or 10,000? Well, in a 2007 paper, Becker and his collaborator said that $15,000 would be a sufficient amount based on their economic modeling. Another group of economists, Held et al., tripled Becker's calculation and came up with 45,000. But they did economic modeling of doubling that 40,000 to get up to 90,000. So 50,000 is roughly rounding up from 45,000, but that's the essence of the economic science behind doing it. It's an educated guess as to whether or not this is the right price, which brings us to the issue in economics when we think about living kidney-related donors of the problems of monopoly, monopsony, and price. Monopoly means there's only one entity you can buy a product from. Monopsony is when there is basically one purchaser of a product. So monopoly might be trying to get electricity, or before the breakup of Ma Bell, AT&T. That was really the only place you were going to get your cell phone service, was from New York Bell, New Jersey Bell, all through AT&T, or trying to get electricity from Public Service of New Jersey or Con Ed. Now that market has somewhat changed. Monopsony might be McDonald's buying chicken nuggets. They buy so much chicken that they have a major determinant about what the price is. But that's not the way most of the world works. If I offered to sell you this tie, and I told you I'd sell you my tie for 50 cents, a lot of you might buy the tie. If I told you it was a Countess Mara tie and I wanted to sell it to you for $500, nobody would want the tie. If I was going off to shop for green vegetables in the marketplace, I might go to several booths to see what the price was, or I might bargain over the price. That's a free market. In a free market, when the price is extremely high, then suppliers will put a lot of the product on the market, but buyers won't demand very much of it. If the demand and supply fluctuate inversely because of price, and where they intersect is the equilibrium price, where a willing buyer and a willing seller are willing to buy a tie or green vegetables. But our problem is, how many different vendors are there of federal tax credits? One. You can only get federal tax credits from the federal government. There is no free market to determine how many federal tax credits you need in order to donate your kidney. So you can guess at what the price might be, but you don't know. And the price will not fluctuate in the End Kidney Death Act bill, so we won't know what the price is. What passes for a joke about this was from my professor of Soviet economics when I was an undergraduate. And the Soviet joke during the communist era was, when the Soviet Union takes over the world and everything is communist, we're going to leave New Zealand as the only remaining capitalist country. Why? So we'll know what the price should be of anything. Because in a controlled economy, you don't know what price is. You need a free market to know what price. So that's the problem of the $50,000. Without a marketplace, we'll never know an equilibrium price. The only thing I can think of as a quick analogy is, you're waiting to get on the airplane and the person at the gate says, the flight's oversold. So there's only one flight. You want to be on it. And then the flight announcer says, who will give up their seat for $300, for $400? If you go up too quickly, you're selling yourself short. But if you hang back, you might not be able to sell your seat at all. That is a modified monopoly market, but no such market will exist for the living kidney donors. Okay, there are two issues related to the economic concept of equity of participation. Anyone can decide they want to buy a tie. Anyone can decide they want to buy green vegetables in the marketplace if you have money, but not everyone can participate in the living kidney donation. You can't participate if you have a disease, your blood pressure is uncontrolled, your blood pressure is too high, you have HIV, you're on certain medications. So a whole list of areas make you ineligible to participate in this. Now, if I told you you're not allowed to get federal tax credits if you're HIV positive, you'd say discrimination. Everyone should be able to participate. Well, not if you're trying to get tax credits for kidney donations. Maybe if you want to get a tax credit for making a charitable donation, we don't care about your HIV status, but you can't play, you can't have equity of participation with certain diagnoses in this marketplace. Now, it's not the only thing that we don't have equity of participation. For example, federal child care tax credits. You obviously can't participate in that market unless you have a child. People who want to defend the federal tax credits will say, well, we often volunteer risky behavior with economic rewards, including volunteerism. Do we pay a premium to people to be firefighters or police officers? Well, to some extent we do. Those are risky behaviors, and in the marketplace, their salaries might reflect it. Would we pay a premium to be walking on a beam in a construction site, very dangerous work? Depends what the labor market says. If there are people willing to do it, then the company is going to pay as little as possible to get the job done. That's what a free labor market is. When Richard Nixon was running for president in 1967, he surprised his advisors because he was very much taken with the work of the economist Milton Friedman, who won a Nobel Prize, and his book, Capitalism and Freedom, which I was required to read as a college freshman as an economics major, in which Friedman says no one should be coerced to be in the military. It should be an all-volunteer army. So some proponents of paying people to be living kidney donors say, well, don't we pay a premium for people to be in the military? It's a risky behavior, like we pay premiums to be a police officer or a firefighter. So how can you argue against tax credits for living kidney donation? It's no different than our volunteer army. Some people say it's a no-brainer. It's poppycock, actually, is what it is, because while the military of draftees during the Vietnam War was thought to be a failure because of drug addiction and people getting out after 2 years, a volunteer military is often thought by current people to be a failure because, except for the Marines, the armed forces of the United States have missed their enrollments by 25% per year for the last few years. If we got in a shooting war and needed to send the Navy in full deployment, there are not enough sailors to staff the ships of the United States to send the fleet out. And America's upper classes have largely now outsourced our military to the poor and the black and the marginalized of society. And that's why I think Americans feel differently about war than they used to, because my kids aren't going to get drafted. Your kids aren't going to get drafted because there's no draft. So we're paying someone else to fight our wars. The argument also somewhat fails because 75% of military jobs are not combatant. And in spite of what I've told you, the salaries and benefits of many military jobs are either at or equivalent or a little more than civilian jobs, and they still can't fill them. So I am personally unpersuaded by the military argument. Other arguments against the Living-Related Kidney Donor Act have been articulated by that surgeon who I told you I wrote a paper with in the 1980s, Frank Delmonico, and the ethicist Halperin. They're worried that paying people for donations will undermine altruistic donations. They're worried that disproportionately poor people will be the ones to donate their kidneys. They're worried that people who want to get their hands on the money, and they're going to lie. They're going to take their blood pressure pills in the 2 weeks before they go for their medical assessment, and then they're not going to take them. Or they're going to switch urine samples to prove they're healthier than they really are because they want the money. They're going to be subject to those lifetime risks of donation that I told you about. They're concerned about throwing away usable organs because our standards are different here than the Europeans. And some people try to quote the data from Iran, which I will not. I was giving a lecture a couple of months ago at Harvard on my work in history of medicine, and we were talking about this End Living Kidney Death Act as the lead up to my lecture in the discussion group. And I pointed out to a psychiatrist who was on the Harvard faculty, you know, they're going to expect people like you to create screening tests in the End Kidney Deaths Act. So the people are really not just in it for the money, they really want to do it. And if you wanted to make a psychiatrist burst into laughter, I did. You think that we're going to come up with a reliable test to prove that people are really doing it for altruistic and they just don't want the money. And that's going to stand up in court? No, it won't. Now, in the longer run, maybe all of the things that Rabbi Fogel and I will have to say will be moot. Maybe there'll be xenotransplantation and we'll simply order our hearts and kidneys from genetically farmed pigs, or maybe regenerative medicine will grow organs for us. But until that day comes, we're going to have to talk about Halachah. And I'm going to introduce Rabbi Fogel's remarks by telling you a few seconds of legal theory. We've got a Constitution of the United States, but the Constitution of the United States doesn't say, here's how we're going to regulate aviation, and this is what the Federal Aviation Administration will be. The word airplane does not appear in the Constitution of the United States, written in the 18th century. Doesn't say anything about how we're going to regulate cell phones or the internet. Cell phones and the internet and tablets do not appear in the Constitution of the United States. So how do we come to have government regulation of these entities? Well, there's the federal constitution, there's state constitutions. They empower the legislative branch to make laws and the executive branch to enforce the laws, and the judicial branch sets legal precedents, which through logic eventually gets us to how there could be a Federal Communications Commission or a Federal Aviation Administration. The words xenotransplantation, organ transplantation, kidney donors do not appear in the Constitution of the United States. They do not appear in the Bible either. And so how do you come up with any theory of how Rabbi Fogel can talk about what he's going to be talking about? It is the same pathway as I laid out to you in civil law. You look at what appears in sacred scripture, you look at what appears in the Talmud, you look at the question and answers back and forth between people who pose questions to rabbis and they answer them. You pose questions, shilas, and posek. There are rulings about them. So I will now pass the baton to Rabbi Fogel, who will continue the presentation with his discussion of Halachah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Halperin, for those remarks. And I will hopefully continue on this topic and continue on this topic of ethics, economics, and halacha of compensating living kidney donors with federal tax credits. That should be. I'm sorry. As Dr. Halperin just said, I'm going to jump right in that the way in halacha that we deal with topics is that we look at our sources, Bible, Talmud, codes, and then respond to literature. So, as Dr. Halperin pointed out, one of the original topics was risk. One of the original topics that dealt with kidney donors was, should the donor be allowed to even, is the donor allowed to assume the risk of donating? Again, as Dr. Halperin pointed out in the previous slides, that years ago it was 3 deaths out of 10,000. Today we're under 0.9 deaths for 10,000, but nevertheless, there is some risk, but it has gone down considerably. So in the response to literature, I couldn't get a picture of the Radvaz since he lived in the 16th century, but I have a copy of his book there on the bottom of your screen, and there's a famous question. The famous question is, someone was guilty of a capital crime, and the ruler of Egypt at that time was willing to carry out the capital sentence, and then he turned to his friend and said, well, if you're willing to have your arm cut off, I'll spare your friend's life. And that entered the response to literature as the paradigm case of, does one person have to put themselves at risk to save someone else's life? And that is the case that has been discussed the past 400 years, how to apply that case. You see here, Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg died in 2006. I had met him twice. He was the senior rabbi at the Shaarei Tzedek Medical Center. He also wrote a 21-volume set of responses known as the Tzitz Eliezer, and he is one of the foremost poskim rabbis, decisors of the end of the 20th century and early 21st century. And in his response on this topic, he deals with this question: the risk of the that the donor has versus the benefit to saving the lives, as Dr. Halperin's statistics showed us. The 5-year survival rate is more than double in living kidney donations, and therefore, but he didn't have this information. I created a slide. I'm searching the Talmud for a source on driverless vehicles, but it seems my search engine is stuck in the 5th century. That was my way of contributing to Dr. Halperin's point that the airplane and the cell phone don't exist in the Constitution or the Bible. The same thing that when we look at responsa, we have to make sure that we don't quote responsa that are not that relevant. So with the deaths, with the risk to the donor plummeting, at the same time with the acknowledged benefit to the recipient, could be a lot of the responsa literature of the 70s, 80s, and 90s that dealt with balancing risk versus benefit might not be relevant anymore. There is one interesting aspect that a lot of rabbis have spoken about from just a purely halachic standpoint, and that is fasting. One of the holiest days of the year in the Jewish calendar is Yom Kippur, and that's a 26-hour fast, sundown to sundown, plus till sundown to nightfall. And they studied would the 26-hour fast have an effect on living kidney donors, and the paper concluded that it doesn't. And the reason that I bring this up is that people say, okay, forget about the risk to the donor of mortality, but just how about inconvenience or even just not being able to fast at Yom Kippur? Does that have an effect? But there's really very little in that respect. So therefore, I would say that all the responsa literature on this topic, while important, I don't think is as relevant today. Thankfully, because of the gains in safety. Here you have Shylock. Many of us had to I guess memorize this back in high school. So just to really recap the Merchant of Venice for those who might have forgotten it, but in the Merchant of Venice, Shylock demands a pound of flesh from Antonio, and there's this famous speech where he says he has disgraced me. And he says, and what is his reason? Because I am a Jew, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses. And if you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? And this is, while a wonderful speech, the overall theme and the idea of Shylock seems to be a little bit anti-Semitic, which is that, can you imagine demanding a pound of flesh as payment for a loan? And this has been discussed over and over again. Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin, who was the editor and the founder of Encyclopedia Talmudic. That means in 1940, he came up with this brilliant idea to create an encyclopedia, which gathered everything found in the Talmud, everything found in rabbinic literature. He was the chief editor until his death. Unfortunately, the project is still ongoing, started in 1940. They're about I would say 2/3 of the way through, so it's obviously not so easy. And he wrote an article, is there any basis in Jewish law for Shylock's demands? Meaning, is there a legal framework for paying for someone else's body organ? So here we have a deal. I'll give you 1,000 ducats, and if you don't pay me back, I want a pound of flesh. Is that legally binding? And that would be relevant to our case here as well. And he concludes that there is no legal way to say that one person can sell or even offer as a collateral any body part. He quotes from a famous non-Talmudic verse. He quotes from a famous part of the liturgy, the High Holiday Liturgy, and I have it on the bottom. I apologize that the Hebrew didn't come out so well. I'll just read it in English. The soul is yours, talking to God, and the body is your doing. Have pity on your work. We're asking for God's mercy in the high holy days. The soul is yours, and the body is yours, God. Act for the sake of your name. And this is liturgy when we approach God in the high holy days asking for forgiveness. And he takes this liturgy and he says, well, that applies to the way we view a person's body, that it really is, it's yours, God, and I have no legal right to sell it. And it sounds like a very great idea, that how could I sell, and how could there be a marketplace? How could we ever view selling body parts as Dr. Albert says, green, from the greengrocer or anything that we're talking about? How could you have a marketplace in that? And that was his contribution. And again, understandably, he was fighting against the anti-Semitic nature of the Merchant of Venice, and he was saying that there was absolutely nothing in Jewish law that would condone or accept this idea as legal and as binding. The problem is there's an obvious problem with that. Here you have a picture of Rabbi Usher Weiss. Rabbi Usher Weiss is today, he was not following, but he was recently retired. He was the most recent Halachic decider posek for Shari Tzedek Medical Center. He is one of the leading rabbis today in Israel and in America when it comes to medical halacha issues. He has spoken a few times at Lander College for Men, part of Touro. And there's an inherent contradiction. And from a legal standpoint, something you can't sell, you have no ownership of. Well, you can't donate it either. Donating is just selling without asking for remuneration. So how is it possible that we accept donations and then we don't sell at the same time? There's an organization called Renewal that has recently celebrated 1,200 altruistic kidney transplants. You have Magen David Adom. And if you don't own any body parts, how could you donate your blood? How could you donate plasma? How could you donate your hair? How could you donate sperm or egg? So there's an inherent contradiction. And in his response, he sort of tries to make the point that there's a difference between donating and selling, which is, of course, you own your body to donate. You have the right to give away, especially something that does regenerate, like sperm or hair or blood, but you can't sell it. And he doesn't explain where that comes from. In other words, he seems to be taking the same line of reasoning as Rabbi Zevin, but it's hard to come up with an exact methodology. What is the difference? Perhaps he means, even though he doesn't write this, he means to say that we, as a society, have to treat the body as sacred, or there are certain things that are off limit from commerce, which is again back to, as Dr. Halperin pointed out, from Nota, from the original law, which said that it is forbidden to engage in commerce in body parts. So it could be he doesn't mean it, even though it seems to be saying it because you don't own your body, and that's the literature of the responsa. Perhaps they meant it more as a social means of controlling what could be a problematic. In general, there is a question of being paid for something you should do. The physician is forbidden to take payment for his wisdom and learning. So, to all the medical students listening in live or online, I warn you ahead of time, you may not take any payment for your wisdom and learning. As much money as you have paid us here for your tuition to become a physician, you may not get paid, but you may receive payment for his trouble and lost time. So, right? So you when you go to the physician, you could pay them for seeing you just because otherwise they'd be playing golf maybe, but you can't pay them for their knowledge and wisdom. And that's an interesting line. That's an interesting path to take. And the reason is because physicians are there to save lives. They're there to do a good deed every time they see a patient, every time they prescribe, every time anything they do to save a life, it's a good deed. None of that, it's a mitzvah. It's a commandment. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. This is, by the way, a side topic. We're dealing with a strike in New York City of nurses. Can any healthcare worker strike? They are obligated to help. Who said they could say, because we want more money, therefore we won't work and help people? And I'm sure there are lots of people out there who are going to study this strike and look at the mortality rate, look at what was affected by their striking. So imagine all these people who definitely deserve a higher living wage, but they, at the same time, they're obligated to help people. Were they allowed to do it? That's for another topic for another time, but that's the question here as well. So the codes of Jewish law, here you have from Shulchan Aruch, Yoredeya, 3036-2, comes up with, you may not actually be paid for your knowledge, your wisdom, but at the end of the day, everyone, if you wouldn't be, if I wouldn't pay him, he'd have to get he'd have to get a real job or something. So therefore, you're allowed to pay, even though for sure you're paying for something that really should be given to you free. Nevertheless, there's an understanding that there's lost time and trouble. Therefore, the bottom right, you have Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was one of the leading rabbis, died in January of 95, one of the leading rabbis in Jerusalem, and his student, the Nishmat Avraham, Dr. Abraham, original in Hebrew, translated to English, sat down, and I have it here, the quote, "There is no fundamental Jewish legal prohibition against financial compensation for tissue organ donation." So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is reported to have told the Nishmat Avram, and that he says that, yes, I understand that people should be altruistic, but since at the end of the day, there is a time loss, there is something you're giving, you are allowed to accept payment, even though you really should be doing it altruistically. So seemingly, let's go back to that. So seemingly, at this point, we're at the point that we discussed the general question of risk versus, are you allowed to put yourself at risk? What's the ethics of putting yourself at risk to save someone else's life? Seemingly that today, thankfully, has become less of an issue. We've discussed the question of owning body parts. Are you allowed to decide? We've discussed, are you allowed to accept payment? We're really, so far, it seems, if you look at all the literature and all the relevant ideas, there should be no issue in a way of offering payment. Now, the issue that is raised, that Dr. Halperin pointed out, is the issue of justice. I'm sure you're all aware that in the principles of biomedical ethics by Busham and Childress, they set down 4 medical ethical principles. In the 70s, there was no book, there was no textbook, there was no general consensus of what biomedical ethics principles were, and they came up with autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. And justice, in their words, the minimal principle that like cases should be treated like, or to use the language of equality, equals ought to be treated equally and unequals unequally. That is an important general principle. It's a principle, and the application was used to make it illegal to pay for transfer organs because it was thought to be, and probably will be, an exploitation of the poor. Now, if there'd be a market system, definitely those who have money will buy, those who don't have money will not, those who don't have money will sell, those who do have money will not, and therefore it'll be rich buying, poor selling. Complete inequality. Now, the End Kidney Deaths Act actually removes that problem because the payer is not the recipient, but rather the federal government. So therefore, everyone has the money. So it will not make it that only the rich can purchase and the poor will sell, because everyone is rich in this scenario because the government is paying for you. There is one payer. So in that scenario, but everyone will be able to be a recipient. So we've lessened the inequality from a free market system because we have, instead of having rich buying, poor selling, we have everyone buying because one payer, federal government, but we have only one. But at the end of the day, the injustice, the inequality is the people who need the money selling. Now, of course, everyone can turn down the money, and there are people out there who are altruistic donors, but nevertheless, the assumption being that the poor will be selling, and that is an inequality. Now, how do we deal with inequality? And that's a big topic we can talk about all day. I always ask when I speak about this, how many people use FastPass at Six Flags, and are you okay with that inequality? And we could talk about that some other time. But what does Judaism have to say about inequality? Now, I want to point out that not everyone agrees to this idea that it will create inequality. Perhaps many people will sell. Perhaps it will benefit the poor just as much by now offer, because they could also be, once there also be buyers, there is no inequality. So what does Judaism have to say about this very important concept of justice? I don't know. No, I do know. What I mean to say is this concept is we have to look for it, right? Again, it was created in the 1970s with the need to create a principles of biomedical ethics after all of the biomedical ethical transgressions and all of the mistakes made in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s throughout the world and earlier. So this book was, came up with this idea of justice. But if you look at Judaism, what is the idea of justice? Where would you find justice? Where would you find the idea of equality? So that's where we have to sort of think about a little bit out of the box, looking at our Talmud, looking at our codes to come up with a possible source. In Deuteronomy, 7 verses apart from each other, there is a contradiction. This is classic Bible. 7 verses, seemingly, one verse says, there shall be no needy among you. God promises the eternal God will bless you, and there will be no more poor people. 7 verses later, for there will never cease to be needy ones. Well, God, I may ask, will there be poor people or will there not be poor people? The Talmud tells us a story, which Gemini has quickly summarized for us in cartoon form. There were 2 rabbis, Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan. They were sitting in poverty and learning. And they decided that it says that there will be no poor people. We're going to go to work. Time to leave the sanctuary, time to leave the holy walls of the Talmud Institute, and they left. And the ministering angels were like, they're going to push the wall down on them and say, because they left their promising future. But only one of the rabbis heard the angels, so one went to work and one stayed in the halls of the Talmudic Academy. The one who stayed became obviously the head of the Talmudic Academy. And the one who went to work was passed over as the head of the Talmudic Academy. He became a rich man. And they were like sort of saying, listen, if you would have stayed, you could have been the head of the Talmudic Academy. And the story goes that he went to the mast of one of his ships, and he says, there is not one piece of Talmud and one rabbinic statement that I do not know. And that's the bottom picture. I use this story in the Talmud as there's really an inherent tension between can we tolerate inequality? Can we tolerate the fact that there will be poor people and that's just the way of the world? Or should we all work hard to end that inequality? And it seems that it's a contradiction in the Bible in and of itself. I also was thinking of that picture with the men working on the whatever building is in Manhattan without any safety equipment, but I figured that we'll upgrade it to a little more modern. Here you have either wind turbines, offshore wind turbines. How do we allow people to take these jobs? Perhaps wind turbines and offshore oil rigs and offshore wind turbines should be illegal. How do we allow people to assume risk just for the benefit of society? The Talmud has an interesting throwaway line. The law in the Bible is you have to pay your workers on time. And the Bible is quite strict on that. If a daily worker has to be paid by the end of the day. There's no payday at the end of the week. You have to pay a daily worker daily. Now again, different financial situations have different laws. But the Talmud takes that. It says, for he sets his soul upon it. If you delay payment to your laborer, you're really taking away his soul. He works for money. How could you deny him that? And now the Talmud has a throwaway line. For what reason did this laborer ascend at a tall ramp or suspend himself from a tree and risk death to himself? Was it not for his wages? How can his employer delay his payment? So the Talmud is explaining how egregious it is not to pay your workers on time. And the parable it uses is he even risked death for his job. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the Nod Yehuda, the decisors throughout, and Chazon Ish, though just quoting the three great decisors, have all used this, I would say, throwaway line of the Talmud to explain that, and there's a difference amongst them, that'll be in the footnotes. There is a difference, but they all agree that you're allowed to choose to put yourself at risk for compensation. If it's a job, if it's somehow normal, if it's somehow accepted in society, you will be allowed to go ahead and do that. And even though it's seemingly unjust that certain people could sit in an auditorium and have a job, and some people have to be out standing on top of the world or at the bottom of the world, as it would be, nevertheless, you are allowed, and not only that, it's accepted to go ahead and put yourself at risk for compensation. So, meaning, in other words, that even though there's an injustice in the system, and there's an injustice that some people will have to work, put themselves at risk to have a salary, some others won't, nevertheless, it is accepted. Now, at the bottom right, you have ChatGPT's version of my question, and top left is ChatGPT, bottom is Gemini. And there's a reason I have both, and I'll explain in a second. But there in the Talmud, in the Bible, it says you must give charity. Of course, we understand there are poor people, there are the downtrodden, and you have to provide and help them. I have a great idea. If I'd be a minister of the court, if I'd be a judge, if I would have a poor person come in front of me, so you know what? Even if he's not right, I'll fine for him. That way, he'll win money in a court. It'll feel like I'm doing him a favor. And in this week's Torah portion, it says, do not show partiality to the poor in a lawsuit. So I got a poor guy. On one hand, I have to treat him. I got to take care of him. I got to give him charity. I got to make sure he's okay. And at the same time, if it's in a court case and he's wrong, he's in the wrong, he doesn't deserve any payment, I can't be partial to him just to help him out. What about helping the poor? So you see, there's this, I would say, tension between, on one hand, you want to help the poor, on the other hand, you have to do what's right. And here you have the same image. And I think, so I'm showing this to you for an interesting thought. I gave the same exact prompt to ChatGPT and Gemini. And they came up with these two different, and you can vote on which is better if you'd like. Didn't offer a poll. But to me, it symbolizes the question at hand here. To say that when it comes to an ethical discussion, we have a clear answer, we know what's right, we can decide exact numbers, or we can decide what's the exact right way to do something, that really is not how we deal with ethical questions. The way we deal with ethical questions is that we know that there are two correct things in front of us. We have, like here, we have taking care of the poor, and also being absolutely straight and just in justice, and making sure you don't deviate an iota from the truth, even though you would have a benefit from it. So there's always this tension of what's right and what's right. There's two things that are right. On one hand, you don't want to be unjust. On the other hand, you want to save lives. On the other hand, definitely, if we can increase living kidney donations, we would definitely increase lifespans and lives. At the same time, we don't want to be unjust. How do you balance those two if they're both right? And I think that part of always ethical thinking is trying to figure out how to take two right things, two right ideas, and balancing the two. So just to conclude with the same slide that Dr. Halperin opened with, one of the reasons we publish these books, these medical halacha annuals, is deal with these questions to present to the public the underlying issues, the underlying tensions between right ideas, and I guess it'll be up to the decisors and those who make policy to decide what is actually ethically correct and what will be legal. I thank you for the opportunity to speak for you today.
What I want to ask about, what do you think the future of altruism is? And where is altruism in our current society? Do you think it's changed? Do you think that affects this? And if so, what effect is there on it? And there are many examples of people signing up for various professions because of altruism. But I just wonder, what do you think about that?
In the preparation of this talk, I read a couple of stories of altruistic living kidney donors. And what they wanted to share was they were fine making the donation to a person unknown. But having gone through the procedure and realizing how much time they lost from work, how much pain they went through, they offered the following thought. Everybody in the operating room is getting paid except me. The anesthesiologist and the surgeon and the nephrologist, they're all billing for procedures for this. The only one who's not getting anything is me. Am I the purest altruist, or am I entitled to something in return for losing time from work and being in pain for making the kidney donation? What do I think the future of altruism is? I think anyone who participates in interviews for admission to medical school and dental school feels pretty good about the future, because they continue to encounter altruistic young people who want to give their lives to healthcare. What am I worried about altruism? I'm worried about studies that show that if you look at altruism indices of American medical students, they fall very impressively during 4 years of medical school, as if we wring it out of them with the unwritten curriculum. That gives me some pause. Rabbi Fogel?
Yeah, so it's hard to predict the future of altruism. Do a mitzvah. If you view and you could consistently are educated that you are responsible for the people around you, for other people, I think there's a good future. If we tend to only think of ourselves, and if we tend to focus on those who are trying to take stuff from us, it looks like a bleak future. So I'm not in a position to predict the future of altruism, but I think that the more we focus on what we are responsible to others, there is a possibility that, and which is what we try to educate here. And I guess that would be the point of this lecture, Dr. Kupersmith.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say that I think it's an excellent discussion, and I really learned a lot from you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the auditorium. Dean Schluber.
Yeah, thanks. I thought that was an excellent discussion. Thanks very much for it. I have a question, but I want to respond to this for a minute. Dr. Kupersmith's question, and make a suggestion. Michael Sandel, a professor of government at Harvard, wrote a book a few years ago called What Money Can't Buy, where he really argued against things like the commodification of the human body. And one could include something like this in that category. It seems to me that part of his argument would be that the commodification of the human body would lead to a decrease in altruism. People would say, this is worth something to me. Every part of my body has a monetary value, and why should I give it to anybody? You need to pay me. So that was just my response to that. But I do have a question. It goes back, Ed, to your point, and also Rabbi Fogel, point you made. You pointed out that a living kidney donor, there's absolutely no benefit to that donor, except perhaps the good feeling that comes from doing something altruistic. There's another situation in medicine where people participate in activities that cannot benefit them at all, and we create a benefit to encourage them to do that. Those are phase 1 drug trials in healthy volunteers. So every drug, when it enters phase 1, is tested in a healthy volunteer who cannot possibly benefit. They have no medical condition that would be helped by that drug. No one does that for altruistic reasons. We create a benefit by paying them. And I would also argue that nobody actually even knows the risk of that, because phase 1 drug trials are almost never reported in the medical literature because there's no reason to. The pharmaceutical company needs to know that information, but nobody else needs to know it. And in fact, most drugs that proceed to phase 1 go no further, or only very little further. 90% of all drugs fail in clinical trials. So presumably the risk is real. So we allow that. Why is that different than this? I mean, you could make an analogy that it's like the firefighter or the guy on the wind turbine. We need this for society. Is it just that, or is it closer to the kidney donation problem?
I went first last time. You take a shot.
I mean, I do believe the difference would be that would be like paying anyone to do anything. Once you have informed consent, and once it's not, there's an autonomous decision, it's informed consent. It's not unjust because there is no, it's not just poor college students. I mean, that could be this.
Well,
that
largely is.
Right. It could be this. That could
is.
Exactly. So, but since we don't, I guess, recognize them as a protected class, then we just look at it as something people do for money. And with autonomy and informed consent, that would seemingly get rid of the problem of injustice. There is no class that is created. the worry here when it's with organs and something that in a way is permanent forever, which again, I'm sure there are some trials that do some damage in some way. I think that's why they make that difference. That's how I understood it.
The economist term for what you just described, Neil, is called monetary versus non-monetary compensation. And non-monetary compensation is real. People's feeling of self-worth, how much admiration they're held in by other people. Those are real benefits also for the so-called altruistic donor. If you look up a dictionary definition of the word gift, it says something which is freely given without any expectation of anything being given in return. But that's not really why most of the time we give gifts. We give gifts because we're looking for something reciprocal from giving a birthday gift or an anniversary gift that we're recognized as a gift giver. So I think non-monetary compensation is real, including in phase 1 trials. We have a comment from someone who was an altruistic kidney donor and wants to make the point that I don't know of anyone, including myself, who wouldn't have donated despite all the salaries being paid for their work. Someone comments about something similar to I called you the Monaco Capron objections. Are you concerned that deceased donor families who do not get reimbursed or get credits may come back and say, why should we donate? That's an issue raised by some people who write about this. Will we end up, if we have compensation, undermining others who might donate, saying, well, I want to be in on the money also? There's a comment here that due to well-documented health disparities, poor people are sicker. They may not be as likely to be approved to be donors. They won't meet the criteria to be living-related donors. Someone is emphasizing the point that while low-income people may be more likely to donate, they are much more likely to die from end-stage renal disease than the average. And so there is a possibility that the system may benefit them. Someone writes in that in Israel, they compensate living kidney donors by paying insurance premiums for 3 years, 40 days of wages, therapy visits, and a week's vacation. We have a physician writing in about whether or not one could learn something about the market for kidneys by analyzing data in black markets and kidneys and what people are willing to pay in less economically developed countries for kidney donation. There is a comment that do not hold out hope that xenotransplantation will be a long-term solution because of the current lifespan of likely to be shorter for xenotransplanted kidneys. Seeing nothing else in the chat box and nothing in the room, thanks everyone for joining us and have a good afternoon.